Boards are sitting ducks when it comes to director pay lawsuits. I'm Chris Clark, and this is BoardVision. I'm joined today by Marty Coyne, experienced director and the president of our New Jersey chapter, and Dan Laddin from Compensation Advisory Partners. Welcome, gentlemen.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris.
I want to start out in this way in talking about director compensation. This is an ongoing debate, and do you think that the NomGov committee or the compensation committee should be responsible? I'll start with Dan.
Chris, if we look at the market, it's pretty mixed, a little bit leaning towards compensation committee versus NomGov. At the end of the day, I think it really comes down to the principles you use for compensation of your directors overall. One, you want to make sure you have an objective committee, which obviously you would on either. You also want to make sure that the compensation for directors aligns with the philosophy of the directors. And so in that sense, maybe the compensation committee is a little closer to that. Flip side is the NomGov committee is a little closer to the recruiting and bringing in directors from a diverse group of individuals. So having familiarity with the compensation program is always helpful, and involvement in that process. At the end of the day, there's a lot of cross-pollination usually across those two committees, so either really works fairly well. We do see a little bit leaning towards the comp committee though.
Thanks, Dan. Marty, you've been on all types of boards. What's your take?
Yeah, I prefer compensation committee,
Okay.
but mainly because the comp committee is much more familiar dealing with the compensation consultant. They're much more familiar with the peer group. And so when you look at all of the data inputs, the comp committee understands kind of the source, where the weaknesses are, the strengths. I think one of the key things, though, is that the full board approves director compensation. So regardless of which committee brings it forth and brings forth the recommendation, the full board has to vet it and approve it.
In many cases for leading governance practices, company size does matter. They're affected by different policies, regulations. Their boards are occasionally very different. Occasionally they're not. But when it comes to director compensation, it is a hot button, and it certainly affects that board's reputation, the company's reputation, and most importantly, that individual director's reputation. So Dan, let me start with you. Do you feel that there's a company size factor here when it comes to compensation and reputation?
I think the reputation risk exists regardless of the size of the company, and that's somewhat borne out by the compensation data we would take a look at. If you look at it, the smaller side of companies, let's say $500 million to $1.5 billion, pays in the $200,000, $210,000 range. If you go 10x of revenue companies to $15 billion plus companies, you only see that increase to about $260,000, which to us says there's a basic responsibility of directors that doesn't really change regardless of company size, and that's really reflected in the compensation data.
Yeah. Marty?
There is a scale that the bigger the company, the more the directors are paid. The exposure potential for larger company directors is far greater than the smaller company directors because they just make better news than the smaller companies. There is a point, though, it's almost like a minimum size where when you hit it, where the director workload is pretty much the same regardless of the size of the company. And to attract and retain good directors, you've got to pay a fair compensation for those individuals.
Many companies have director compensation limits. My question would be why, and what is a fair compensation limit?
Sure. So this concept of the limits really has come into play in the last few years as there were a few lawsuits against companies that said directors are inherently conflicted when they're setting their own pay, and those specific companies, the view was that they set it well above any credible norm. Given that inherent conflict of setting their own compensation, the Delaware court said that no longer stands in this case. However, the attorneys came in and said, we can basically put in a shareholder approved limit on directors' compensation, which then gets us back within this business judgment rule.
For the shareholder approved limit, what's the status today?
We're seeing most companies, as they go back to shareholders to renew their plans in the normal course, that's when they go back and put in a limit as well. When they go back for new equity plans or just general approval from shareholders, that's when it's happening. I wouldn't say there's a mad rush to do it, but it's normal course.
Well, Marty, what's been your experience? You've been on public boards, you've been on private boards.
Yeah, I think having a limit is very, very valid, and it's necessary. I don't see any resistance to putting limits on directors' compensation. If I were a shareholder, I would expect my compensation plan that I'm approving to have limitations for director comp.
When we look at the umbrella of business judgment and compensation, I've got to ask you, is the litigation environment, is it lukewarm or is it red hot?
I would say that it's lukewarm at this point. The lawsuits have really been at the extremes, where director compensation was well above the norm.
Yeah.
Marty?
And I think, Chris, that just following up on what Dan said, that there's been a quantum step forward on the non-gov side in choosing the right directors sitting around the table. I think the next step is going to be, how do you compensate your directors? What is your philosophy to attract and retain good directors? How does director compensation correlate with company performance? Is there potential pay at risk? I think there'll be some probably comparisons of director comp to TSR. And if a company's not performing well, I think directors are going to have to answer a lot of tough questions about, why are we paying you when the company performance is so poor? But I don't see any dramatic changes in the next couple of years.
Well, that's closer to being red hot than lukewarm. So I really thank the both of you today. Very useful commentary. I appreciate your time today.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
If you'd like more information on this very same subject, I urge you to go to the NACD site, nacdonline.org, or to the Compensation Advisory Partners site. I'm Chris Clark, and this is BoardVision.